In a remote valley in West Virginia, there's a town you won't find on most maps. The locals call it Ashwood Hollow, and every evening, before the sun disappears behind the hills, they lock every single door. Not just their homes, but the entire town. They say it's for safety, but what they're hiding is far worse than any stranger who might wander in. It was late October 1994 when Jack Miller, a 27-year-old freelance journalist, drove into Ashwood Hollow. He had heard whispers about a vanishing, a drifter who supposedly disappeared after sundown. The place seemed quaint enough at first. Wooden porches, the smell of burning firewood, children's laughter drifting through the crisp air. But something was off. Every clock in town showed the exact same time, 4:45 p.m. Jack stopped at a small diner to grab coffee. The woman behind the counter, mid-50s, barely looked at him before saying, "You're not from here. You should leave before sunset." Jack laughed, thinking it was just small-town superstition. But her hands were shaking as she poured the coffee. She leaned in and whispered, "When the sky turns black, they walk. And if you see them, it's already too late." By 5:15, Jack noticed shopkeepers pulling metal shutters down. A man with a toolbox hammered heavy bolts into his front door. Street lamps flickered on even though there was still daylight. The sound of locks clicking shut echoed through the streets. It was as if the town was preparing for a siege. Jack, curious and stubborn, decided to stay. He checked into a small boarding house run by an old man named Harris. Harris told him, "Lock your door at sunset, no matter what you hear." That night, as the last orange light disappeared, Jack heard the first sound, a slow, deliberate knock on his window. On the second floor. Jack froze. The boarding house was completely dark now, except for the weak glow of his bedside lamp. The knock came again. 3 slow taps, each one heavier than the last. He stepped closer to the window, but Harris's voice echoed in his mind. "No matter what you hear, don't open it." Jack's hand hovered over the curtain, and then something scraped along the glass, long, sharp, like nails. Then came the whisper, so faint he thought it was in his head. "Jack, let me in." His stomach dropped. No one in town knew his name. He stepped back, his breath quickening. The voice grew clearer, almost sweet now. "It's cold out here. You wouldn't leave me, would you?" Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. The scraping stopped. Silence. And then the doorknob downstairs began to turn. The creak of floorboards startled him. Harris was there, shotgun in hand, his eyes wild. "Away from the window," he hissed, yanking the curtain shut. "They can't come in unless you invite them, but they'll try every trick in the book to make you open the door." Jack tried to speak, but Harris only pointed to the bedroom. "Lock it, and for God's sake, don't answer if you hear my voice after dark." For the next hour, Jack lay in bed, listening, footsteps pacing outside, sometimes slow, sometimes running. Then a woman's voice screamed his name over and over until it broke into sobs. But when he dared to peek through the curtain, the street was empty. No footprints in the frost, no sign anyone had been there at all. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the sound came again. Knock, 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 then silence. Then his bedroom door creaked open. Harris stood there smiling. "It's over. You can come out now," he said softly. Jack almost believed him, until he saw it. Harris's feet weren't touching the floor. When Jack finally opened his eyes, daylight was streaming through the thin curtains. For a moment he wondered if the night had been a dream, but the deep scratch marks on his windows said otherwise. Harris was gone. Downstairs, the boarding house was eerily silent. No guests, no clinking cups, no radio. Just the faint ticking of an old clock. Outside, the street was almost empty, save for a hunched old woman scattering salt across her doorstep. In the only store in town, Jack tried to make small talk with the shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with hollow eyes. New here? The man asked without looking up. Jack nodded, starting to mention the noises last night, but the man's hand shot up, cutting him off. Don't speak of them in daylight. They listen, even now. He slid a brown paper bag across the counter. Inside was a brass key, a small vial of black salt, and a note. Stay indoors after sundown. Never answer your name. Back at the boarding house, Jack unfolded the note fully. On the back was a hand-drawn map of the town. Certain houses were circled in red, others crossed out completely. At the edge of the map was a scribbled warning. Do not go near the hollow after dark. They own the water. Jack didn't understand, but something in his gut told him it wasn't a metaphor. In the afternoon, Jack walked past the town's old stone well. A man in a faded coat stood beside it, staring into the black water. Without looking up, he said, "Once they know your name, they'll never stop." "You've heard them already, haven't you?" Jack froze. The man finally turned, and his eyes were cloudy as if drowned long ago. "Don't drink the water," he whispered before shuffling away. That evening, Harris appeared again, more grim than before. "They've taken an interest in you," he muttered. "It happens faster with outsiders." Jack demanded answers, but Harris only repeated the rules. Lock doors, cover mirrors, never respond to the voice. "And if they call from the water," Harris added, "run." By the time the sun began to set, the air in Ashwood Hollow felt heavier, as if the light itself was reluctant to leave. Jack locked the windows, bolted the doors, and drew the curtains, remembering Harris's words. But outside, the streets didn't empty this time. A few figures stood at the corners, motionless, all facing the same direction, towards the hollow. It started earlier than before. At exactly 9:03 p.m., there was a knock, soft at first, on the back door. Jack froze. Then it came again, 3 slow knocks. He remembered the rule. Never answer your name. And then, a voice. "Jack, it's me, Harris. Let me in." But something was wrong with the way it spoke. Too smooth, too slow, as if learning the words for the first time. Jack didn't move. But in the reflection of the glass cabinet, he saw it, the shape at the window. Not Harris. Taller, thinner, with limbs that bent the wrong way. Its head tilted slowly, impossibly, until it was upside down, grinning with teeth too long for a human mouth. From the kitchen, water began to trickle. The tap hadn't been on before. Jack crept closer, every instinct telling him not to look. But he did. The water in the sink was black, rippling though no air moved. Then the voice came from inside it, bubbling up. "We know you." The knocking turned violent. Something scraped along the wood, slow and deliberate, before long, skeletal fingers pushed through the gap at the frame. They didn't look wet. They looked burned, the skin peeling in ribbons. Jack stumbled back, clutching the brass key and the vial of black salt, praying it would be enough. And then, silence. For nearly an hour, nothing moved. Jack almost dared to breathe, until he heard it. The softest sound of all. From upstairs, footsteps, but the floor above him was empty. The wooden staircase creaked under the weight of something unseen. Jack gripped the brass key so hard it bit into his palm. the black salt pouch clenched in the other. He could hear breathing now, not human breathing, but a wet, dragging inhale that filled the air with the smell of rot. At the top of the stairs, the landing stretched into darkness. The air was thick, humid. From the second bedroom, a faint glow spilled out. It flickered like candlelight, but Jack knew every candle in the house was with him downstairs. The door was ajar, swinging slightly, though there was no breeze. Jack pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, almost. In the far corner, facing the wall, stood Harris. His clothes were wrong, wet and clinging. But what froze Jack's blood was the way his neck bulged, as if something was pressing out from the inside. Harris? Jack's voice cracked. Slowly the figure began to turn, but the movement was jerky, as though bones were snapping with each shift. When it faced him, the eyes were gone, empty sockets dripping black liquid. The mouth opened too wide, and a second mouth inside whispered, "Not Harris." The thing dropped to the floor on all fours, moving in short, violent jerks, its limbs bending backwards. Jack threw the black salt across the threshold, the grains hissing on the wood as if hitting something hot. The creature stopped, tilting its head at an impossible angle. Then, with a speed no human could match, it scrambled up the walls and onto the ceiling. It launched itself toward him. Jack fell back. The brass key clutched like a blade. When the creature's hand touched the threshold, the black salt seared it, smoke rising from blistering flesh. It let out a scream. No, dozens of screams layered together before vanishing into the shadows. From the darkness of the hallway came another voice, weak, trembling. "Jack, it's me." Harris stepped into the light, this time real, pale, shaking with blood under his fingernails. He whispered, "You let it see you. Now it won't stop." They sat in the kitchen, both shaking. Harris's voice was hoarse, the words spilling out like he'd been holding them in for years. "It wasn't always like this," he said. "The hollow used to just watch. Then someone fed it." Jack frowned. "Fed it?" Harris nodded. "Blood, first an animal, then a person. Once it tastes a life, it doesn't just take, it follows." Harris pulled a brittle, yellowed map from a tin box under the floorboards. It was hand-drawn, the ink faded but still legible. Marked in red circles were places around the hollow. Some had dates, 1882, 1901, 1924. "Disappearances," Harris said, "every time 3 nights in a row. By the third night, no one ever made it out." Harris leaned in close, his breath trembling. "If it's after you, Jack, you can't sleep. You can't stay in one place. And you can't ever look at its face again." Jack thought about the thing upstairs, about the black liquid dripping from its eyes. He swallowed hard. Too late. Harris explained the ritual, a circle of 9 candles, salt, and the brass key placed at the center. They had to start before midnight and keep the flame burning until dawn. "If a candle goes out," Harris said, "it can get in." Jack tried to keep his hands steady as they placed the candles on the floorboards. The wind outside began to howl. At 12:17 a.m., the first knock came. It wasn't on the door. It was inside the wall. Slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the room to the other. Then, silence. Jack's candle flickered violently. "Don't move," Harris whispered. "It's testing us." Jack heard it, his own voice calling his name from the other side of the room. He turned his head, and in the corner, something shaped like him stood in the dark. The copy's smile stretched unnaturally wide. "You're not supposed to look at it?" Harris hissed. Jack snapped his head forward, eyes fixed on the brass key. At 3:03 a.m., the wind slammed against the cabin so hard one candle's flame died. Cold rushed into the circle like a living thing. From the ceiling, black liquid began to drip, drop by drop, each sizzle echoing in the salt line. "Light it!" Harris screamed, but the matchbox shook in Jack's trembling hands. A long, pale arm slid into the circle, fingers twitching like spider legs. It reached for the brass key. Jack lit the candle just as the fingertips grazed the metal. The arm recoiled violently, vanishing into the ceiling with a screech that rattled the glass. By the time the sun broke over the hollow, Jack's head was pounding, and his hands were raw from clutching the key. Harris looked worse, his skin pale as paper. "One more night," he said, voice almost gone. "If we make it through, it lets you go." But Jack could see it in Harris's eyes. He didn't believe it. The hollow was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no insects. Even the trees seemed to lean inward, listening. Harris sat by the window, staring into the tree line like he was waiting for someone. Jack felt the weight in the air, the kind of silence that comes before a scream. "I lied," Harris said suddenly. His voice was low, broken. "It doesn't just take you if you survive the third night. It takes the one you're with." Jack stared. "Why me?" Harris's eyes glistened. "Because I brought you here." They rebuilt the candle circle, but Harris placed the brass key not in the center, but closer to Jack. Jack noticed, but before he could speak, the knocking began again. Only this time it was coming from above, in the attic. Heavy, dragging steps. At 2:44 a.m., the attic door swung open. It descended slowly, on all fours, its limbs bending backwards, head hanging upside down. When it lifted its face, the skin was stretched thin, eyes black and wet, mouth filled with teeth that didn't match. Harris's whisper was almost lost in the wind. "Don't look," but Jack already had.
The thing stopped at the edge of the candlelight, hissing. Harris stepped out of the circle. Jack shouted for him to stop, but Harris only smiled faintly. "It always takes one," he said. "Better me than you." The hollow moved in a blur, swallowing him into the shadows. Jack was alone. The candles flickered wildly. The brass key began to rattle on the floor, sliding toward the darkness as if pulled by invisible hands. Without thinking, Jack grabbed it, and the entire cabin went silent. When dawn came, the hollow was empty. Jack stumbled into the morning light, the key still warm in his palm. Behind him, the cabin sagged like it had aged 100 years overnight. The forest was still again. Too still. Months later, a hiker found Jack's tent deep in the hollow, empty, the brass key lying neatly on a folded map. On the map, a new red circle had been drawn. The date was fresh. The search team's camera kept rolling even after they radioed in that the trail was cold. One of the crew, Mark Holloway, lingered at the edge of the tree line. Through the lens, just beyond the trees, something stood perfectly still. A man, tall, gaunt, his clothes shredded, face pale as ash. In his hand, a brass key glinted in the weak light. The man raised a finger to his lips, as if warning them to stay silent. And then, with the sound of leaves folding in on themselves, he stepped backward and vanished. The footage ends there. Jack Holloway's body was never found. If you love real-life inspired horror stories, the kind that blur the line between truth and nightmare, then Fear Diaries is where you belong. Every week, we bring you cinematic, documentary-style tales of haunted places, unsolved disappearances, and terrifying encounters. Hit subscribe and join thousands who already know. Some stories don't end when the credits roll.